It's Bigfoot Collectors Club with Bryce and Michael. I know a ghost story or two. Let's do this.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Bigfoot Collectors Club, the show where we talk to amazing guests about their personal paranormal history and share stories of high strangeness. I am your host, Michael McMillan. With me usually is your other host, Bryce Johnson, and super producer, Riley Bray. However, this week, the team has been fractured and scattered into the four winds. I am recording from a remote location, which is why this sounds a little bit different than usual. Riley is off on a job, and of course, we all know where Bryce is, living with a family of Bigfoot somewhere deep in the Canadian forest. But fret not, we have an amazing episode for you guys today. I had a chance to sit down via Skype with author Linda S. Godfrey, she's been on the show before, about her new book called I Know What I Saw, and we get into it. This episode has everything. We've got centaurs. That's right, there are centaurs mentioned. Nazi werewolves, gnomes, elves. I don't think we talk about unicorns or mermaids, but I'm telling you, this one is chock full of weird stuff. So I want to get over to that, but before we do, a little bit of business. Guys, we have our High Strangeness t-shirts on sale right now at tpublic.com/Bigfoot Collectors Club. That's our Bigfoot Collectors Club t-shirt and merch shop over TeePublic. Check them out. The High Strangeness shirts by artist Ryan Cody are cool. Please pick up one of those. And then also dropping at the end of the month is the new album by Suneaters, the band that wrote our theme song, Come Alone. They have a new album dropping called Unfathomable Darkness, and Come Alone is on that album, will be. And also, at the very end of this episode, you're going to get a sneak peek at one of the other tracks from that album. So let's go over, talk to Linda. Come back here, I'll wrap it up, and then I'll send you away with a sweet, sweet song by Suneaters. Our guest today is an author, illustrator, investigator of the strange, and one of America's foremost authorities on modern-day monsters. Her past works include Monsters Among Us, American Monsters, Real Wolfmen, and she was the journalist that broke the story of the Beast of Bray Road. Her new book drops next week, which means it is up for pre-order right now, and it's titled I Know What I Saw, Modern-Day Encounters with Monsters of New Urban Legend and Ancient Lore. Please, welcome back to the show, Linda S. Godfrey. Hi, Linda.
Hi there, Michael. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy that you came back to talk to us. Last time that we spoke to you, which was in October, you had just mentioned the new book, and I made you promise that you would come back and talk to us as soon as it was out. And it's dropping on July 16th, which is Wednesday, correct?
Yes.
Or Tuesday. Tuesday.
Tuesday, actually. Yeah, it's been 3 kind of long years. I've never had a book take this long, but it's a complex subject and has a lot of different things in it that required some sort of deep searching for archaic things. So I'm glad that it's out there. I'm glad to be talking about it. It's just been a while coming.
Yeah, I was going to say, this book is, first of all, I read it. I loved it. I'm so glad I got a copy. So thank you for that. And, you know, as I've mentioned on the show before, I just really, really enjoy your work. And this one is like, it's a great, fast read, especially if you like to read monster stories and encounters like I do. But they're really, I mean, this is really a complex book. And there's a lot of stuff in it. And so, I mean, like, how did you go about approaching this book, and what makes it different from your past works? Let's just jump right in.
Well, it actually started out with a different title, which was something like American Monsters, American Legends, things about American Legendary. I'm not saying it correctly because it was a little bit ungainly, and I never did memorize the whole thing. But I had it was American Terrors was the main byline of it.
Oh, that's
and
cool.
It was cool, and the editor who was there, who was also very cool, wanted me to do something showing and comparing and contrasting ancient myths, not quite so ancient legends, and some of the new urban legends, such as Slender Man, etc.
Right.
And put those together. And, it was a cool idea, and I was glad to do it. And then that publisher, Penguin, merged with Random House. And in the process of putting those two giant publishers together, people got swapped around and taken out and put back in, and I ended up with a different editor. And it was I was very sad to see the first one go, but it did free me up in some ways to change it a little bit and change the emphasis to include not just a certain group of modern creatures, but some other ones that I think people will be really interested in. Like, I'm sure you noticed the dire dogs, not dire wolves.
Oh, yeah. I want to get into that in a little bit. The dire dog stuff is really fascinating. There's a lot of quadrupeds in this book. I didn't realize how many cryptids out there run around on all fours or maybe six legs. One creature that pops up early that you mentioned in the book, which immediately got my attention, is a centaur in St. Louis.
Yeah. There have been a couple of reports. One was reported right near the St. Louis Arch. And there's not a lot of meat to the stories other than the sighting. The sightings themselves aren't very deep in things that actually happened to the person who was reporting, but just the fact that we are getting sightings of what people swear is half horse, half man. And you wonder how is that? And then you think, well, the Greeks and Romans had centaurs, and where did they get them? And how has it persisted to this time and space where people could look at something and say, oh yeah, that's a centaur? Does that knowledge that previous centaurs existed according to ancient people help inform you in your decision when you're trying to figure out what the heck you're looking at? Or is this something that is just so basic and never changing in itself that it's immediately recognizable? And there are a lot of things that if you read books of lore, you'll find different descriptions for different things. But the main archetypes, especially when they're human/animal, like centaurs, dogmen, cat people, deer people, whatever, seem to be a basic thing in the human psyche that you go to almost any time, any culture, any religion, and you will find half man, half creature beings. And that's another thing that it's just such a curiosity to me as to why that would just be entrenched in us, that it would last throughout time and place.
So do you think that these entities are then, let's just get into it, are then something that's emerging from our collective Jungian, the Jungian collective unconsciousness? Are these entities that maybe we are, almost like I'm sure you've heard of, of a tulpa, something that is sort of brought to life through our consciousness, brought into existence, which, I don't know too much about tulpas. I haven't done a lot of research beyond, just like a couple podcasts I've listened and reading about it. But are these... Here's my question. Which came first, the monster or the myth?
Exactly. That's the main keystone question that this book hangs upon. And, I thought, well, this will be good because I can pick something out, trail it back to where it started, and, we'll have this nice thing all wrapped up like a nice ball of yarn or something. Well, once you go in and you start peeling away the different strands of yarn and trying to separate them by colors, they end up just getting tangled. You have to move one back here and one there. And it gets really difficult to tell. There is one episode in the book where I think I make a good start at it, where there was a local legend in Pennsylvania about this dog lady that supposedly haunted this area of sanatoriums that once were big resorts with springs and all that kind of thing.
Is this the meat hook?
Yes.
Yeah, that story's great. Can you tell us? I don't want to spoil too much about the book, but if you can share any of these, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, and this is actually one of my favorite chapter headings ever, which is a meat hook and a dog lady.
I like that in this one we're really getting into, we had Dog Man, now we have Dog Lady in this book, or Dog Woman. It's sort of like the She-Ra to He-Man. Right. I like that the dog family is growing.
Well, and I found maybe 5 or 6 different stories that were just about dog women or dog ladies. They're kind of rare, and except for one that was in Mobile, Alabama, not too long before this one, this other one I'm talking about showed up. They don't really have any female attributes. Usually they're covered with long hair, so you really can't see or determine what sex they are. They're canines. The one in Mobile, Alabama had long hair and a human-like face and was said to be very pretty, but she's the only one. Another such legend turned out to be an actual elderly woman that lived kind of marooned on this island that just off of Michigan, and it became sort of a party place, and kids who rode their boats out to party would see this woman who was supposedly living with a pack of dogs. Whether they were feral or her own tame ones, wasn't sure. But she would growl and she would go on all fours, and kind of a sad story, really, when you think about the woman. I think she was something real. And there were all these weird legends that had grown up around her, such as there were motorcycle riding Satan worshippers who brought a coffin out there, and she would sleep in the coffin, or she'd be crawling around in the bushes while they were having campfires, and they'd hear growling, and they'd know it was the dog lady. And there is actually a human history. She was possibly a former caretaker on that island before the family that owned it moved away, or that had a big mansion and grounds there moved away, and ended up there just by herself. So there you have an actual person that sort of
inspired the myth. In a way.
Inspired the myth, yeah, or degenerated into it. I'm not sure really which to look at it, because it's just sad. But and there was another one in Texas where it seemed that it was about a real woman, but she was a feral child.
That's the Lobo girl, right? The
Lobo.
What did they call her?
The Lobo girl.
Yeah.
Right.
That one I've read about before. They think that it was kind of like Mowgli, like a baby girl that was raised by a pack of wolves.
Right, exactly.
Fascinating.
And then supposedly she was seen later with her own baby half wolfling. So the women in these types of legends seem to have these really detailed, sort of intimate stories about them that you don't really see with the dog men. The dog men, they're there, they show up, they give you a hard stare in the eye, and then usually they bound off somewhere, unless they're one of the phantom-like types, which are not the same thing at all. But the women they're elusive, they have babies, they prowl around sanatoriums, leap off of stone walls, take habitation in a stone room on a stone wall next to an old sanatorium where there still is a meat hook. Until quite recently, I guess the meat hook is gone now, but it turns out, and I have photos of this stone wall where it exists in the new book.
Yeah, those are cool photos. That looks super creepy. I mean, how old is that wall? What does that date back to? How far does that date back to?
Yeah, it would go back to the late 1800s, when the whole health spa movement started coming about and people discovered all the wonderful fresh springs and thought they would be healthy places for people to rest and put up resorts. And then they turned into sanatoriums once everybody was trying to take care of the tuberculosis outbreaks.
Oh, yeah.
The early 20th century, and they invented this method of fresh air and springs and that kind of thing. So these great big institutional type buildings were built all over, and especially around Michigan and Pennsylvania, for some reason, seem to have a lot of abandoned ones. And this is one that I think it's been turned partly into another business. And the meat hook, sadly, is gone. But that stone receptacle where it was, it actually served the purpose of a cool refrigerator.
Right.
They would pack the meat in there, close it up with some kind of door, and then the meat would stay fresh that they needed for their business. So how it got from there to being the abode of a dog lady, I wasn't sure. But then when I started looking up, if you kind of track each one back and look at the dates and look at the proximity, it seemed to me that it probably started with young people at one end or the other and traveled through the high schools, which are usually the great messengers of legend, and where they were becoming kind of the monster tapping on the car window while necking sort of things.
Right.
And it could easily have traveled within that amount of time, just word from word to mouth, until it reached one end or the other. So you can see how it could have been shared and just spread because it was such really a compelling legend.
It's fascinating how like car culture has helped develop our relationship with these stories and encounters, isn't it? It's like as soon as I feel like teenagers were out driving around in cars, suddenly you had, dogmen or goatmen or creatures clawing at the car, this lizard man of Skateboard Swamp. You hear a lot of stories. There's in outside of Kansas City, where I grew up, I think in just south on the Missouri side of the state, around Harrisonville, there's a legend of a creature called the Ridge Runner, which is supposed to be like some feral kind of cat or wolf man that like runs alongside cars and scratches up cars. It makes me wonder, like, were these entities attacking horse-drawn carriages back in the day, or is this something that is developed as, our culture and our technology has developed? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I actually have a tale that sort of speaks to that. It's in Wisconsin, in the northern unit of the Kettle Moraine State Forest, which is known for Bigfoot reports and Dogman reports, but also has a Goatman. And when you look this up, the Goatman legend goes back to supposedly Civil War days, where there was a horse and carriage with not necking couples. This was more to that age, but it had a young married couple who were taking their honeymoon ride through the woods to get somewhere, and they were actually camping in this covered carriage that they had, and they heard a noise outside of the covered carriage and some kind of grunting sound. And so heroically, the groom told the bride to stay in the carriage, and he would go out and see. And she heard some kind of horrible noises, but never got out of the carriage until morning. And then she went running, looking for her new husband, and there he was, what was left of him, stuck up in a nearby tree.
No. Ugh.
I hate it when that happens.
Wow. How did they know it was a goat man? Who saw the goat man?
Well, supposedly the footprints left were the cloven hooves of large goat, a bipedal goat. And there have been other times where people have claimed to have seen this goat man, who's supposed to still be around. It's by a place called Holy Hill, which is it's a beautiful, imposing Roman Catholic shrine with twin towers that are lit up, and it's a very wild territory where there are mountain-like areas and then river valleys, very steep hills. It doesn't look like any other part of that side of the state at all, but I think that's what helps engender these legends. And there was supposed to be a hermit that had leg injuries and crawled up the entire mountain up to where the shrine was, and the shrine wasn't there at the time, but when he got to it, he was healed and served the church from then on, and then that's supposed to be how that thing grew. So there's a real depth of legend that all kind of link up in that particular case, but they're using the creatures that are showing up there are, again, such archetypes: the hermit, the goat man, the big hairy man, the dog man. the wolves. So it's kind of like these legends rinse and repeat wherever they go.
Yeah, what is it about these hybrid creatures? You talk about this a little bit in the book, but like, what is it about it? Why does it always feel like it's some sort of combination between a human and an animal? What's your theory behind that? I mean, there's the the extraterrestrial hypothesis that this is all like genetic testing done by aliens, or
Yes.
is it something more mysterious than that?
Well, you really go back to like the very earliest cultures, the Sumerians and the Egyptians, and they had all of them half man, half creatures that were related to the gods. And what they were actually doing was choosing the best attributes and the most powerful attributes of all the animals that were around them, wherever they were living at the time, and they would take those traits from the animal to show that this god had all those same powers. It had the strength of the mountain lion, it had the cunning of the wolf, and so they would be, in a way, sort of teaching about the attributes of each of these gods. And I read that somewhere. I didn't make that up. I couldn't quote it to you right away, but I know that is one theory that people have that makes a lot of sense to me. They weren't necessarily always being absolutely saying that yes, these are part animal. It's more that they have the jackal has that quality of foraging around dead people and burials, so that makes it like the god of death.
Right.
It will come snooping to find you. So that's, I think, if you go back to the very early origins, that's kind of where that starts. And then for a long time, that I think that got transmogrified into things like fairy tales and things where these part human, part monsters were just out to get people for some reason or another and do nefarious things to them. And then you get up to modern day, because people couldn't understand except by means of magic or learning how to control auras or spirit bodies that humans are believed to have, related often to their electromagnetic fields or to actual spirits that inhabit the earth and interact with our brains, with the human brains. There are all different levels like that where people are trying to imagine how it could be possible. They look at these ancient pictures of humans and animals and think about that. And we've never had an answer until now, when we can take any two animals and splice and dice their genes. We've got their genomes completely matched. So we can go in and take one gene out, put a different animals in there, or move it over a couple spaces on the DNA spiral, or they call it the CRISPR is CRSPER. I couldn't tell you what it stands for, but it refers to this sort of genetic research. Or you can, we've got mice running around with pig ears growing off their backs, and many times that level of ability, I think, is actually out there. And we've had there's a Russian scientist who's been talking about doing a head transplant to a different body. And I think the last quote that I had in the book was dated in 2017. So now we've had 2 years go by, and who knows what has been done. At that time, they were saying so far they'd been either holding back or they hadn't quite done it yet, although there's no guarantee of that. And this may make me seem negative, but I firmly believe that owing to human nature, how we are, if there is something that can be done, even if it's not necessarily ethical, and somebody possesses the knowledge and the means to do it, they will find a way to do it.
Well, yeah, it's like it's like science is catching up to the old Victorian era mad scientists, machinations, and
We
like
are
H.G.
mad
Wells and Jules Verne. I mean, we are, right? I mean, it's
Frankenstein's monster, just leaps from the old stories to, we're putting together our own monsters. And then, of course, to make the legends, then these things have to get out somewhere and be seen someplace where they can be noted and told of again. And then the whole legend trip starts anew.
Right. So are you implying, do you think it's possible that some of these entities that people have encountered are possibly the like escaped laboratory subjects of some crazy science experiment? Or is it just that culture's overlapping upon itself? You know, it's that tangled weave of Christmas lights where you're trying to find, like you said earlier, trace that thread back to an original source point, and it's just not that simple.
Right, exactly. Well, I sort of sort out urban legends from maybe new legends based on other things by the fact that an urban legend is usually identifiable by being almost the same from place to place. There are just adjustments made for the local terrain, the local customs, the time frame that it's in, that sort of thing. Because you can find like goat men in so many states, so many places. Maryland was just full of them, and they've got this medical. It's I'm trying to think if it's military or just government. Anyway, they have a government medical facility where there is supposed to have been a goat man that was a mad scientist, and somehow I don't know if the juice from the goat man they were trying to make or something went wrong, and he ended up turning into a goat man himself.
That's awesome. That sounds like a Spider-Man villain.
Runs into the woods, and he's been haunting the woods ever since. And also, the same one is supposed to be foisting off on us the so-called chupacabras, where they've got a dead raccoon that the water has pretty much taken the hair off of, and it's the skin has shrunken around the base of all the claws, which makes the claws look really long, but you don't realize it's the shrinking flesh. And they do look really bizarre, but in the final analysis, they're almost always proven to be a dead raccoon or something similar. But you find one of these in a creek near a military installation. And then we go on to the point that military installations often are magnets for strange creature sightings.
We've done a whole episode about that recently, like Edwards Air Force Base, which had UFO activity as well as like Sasquatch activity.
Right, exactly. And werewolf, one chapter I have in this book, you may have seen it, was about the German.
Yeah, that was awesome. Tell our listeners about that.
Yeah, this is kind of incredible. I'd been noticing and putting them here and there where people would write me and say, well, in after World War II, I was posted in Germany, and we were stationed at this place where there was a legend of a werewolf, and I'd look it up, and one I hadn't found before is in this particular book, and again, it was told to me by an Army colonel and his wife, where there was a woman that was supposed to have been a werewolf or something, and I'm not super clear on my details on this one, so I don't want to go into it too much. I could page through my book and look for it, but there were all these different places. It seemed almost every major installation that they had were connected with some sort of very powerful werewolf. And there was one man who was sleeping in a military vehicle overnight because they were kind of bivouacking, practicing. And one jumped up at the very high truck window and looked in, and it had to be enormous for it to have done that. And they found the tracks around it the next day. Well, come to find out that many of these also were supposed to be places where the Germans, the Nazis in particular, were hiding and working on these different sorts of saucers and alien,
like the Bell UFO or the Bell saucer stuff.
Right, Die Glocke, that I think it's called, and that it was somehow tangled with, and also there was a very elite squadron of military people that had the nickname werewolves that were special to Hitler's plans. And so you would find this elite corps of werewolves wherever you had special ops going on back in World War II. Well, here's a weird little thing, and I don't want to bore your listeners, but
not at all. I think you might also be able to hear my werewolf barking in the background, so I apologize for that.
No problem. It's very apropos. Speaking of, but my grandmother, actually both my grandmothers, lived in a western part of Wisconsin that plays into another later chapter, strangely enough.
This is Hillsboro, correct?
Hillsboro, Wisconsin. And it's in the middle of what we call the driftless area because the glaciers stopped there and went around it. Maybe because it's surrounded by 20 miles of mountain-like ridges made up of a special rose quartzite that's very rare. And this is some of the oldest dirt, if you want to say that, dirt compressed into crystals in the world. It was some of the earliest land in the world. And it's right there. And weird things have happened, including large numbers of mountain lions and black mountain lions, or black panthers, which aren't supposed to exist. But anyway, both my grandmothers lived there. And one of them turned out to have been a spy during World War II for the United States.
So cool.
Yeah, I just found this out after I inherited a bunch of her papers.
No way.
And, there's her picture in a big picnic photograph of the OSS for the Russian division that were studying the Russians, and she was Czech and spoke perfect Czech and perfect unaccented English, and so she was used, I think, as a translator mainly. But my other grandmother, who was a very smart woman in her own right, daughter of German immigrants, had a 5th grade education, and she ended up with a pen pal from Germany named Louisa, who was writing her constantly, and who actually, at the time that Germany was finally defeated by the Allies, she was working in some unknown capacity at one of their North Sea military stations where they were doing a lot of these experiments, not too far from Kiel, if you know where that is. And so one of her letters, and I inherited her letters along with my other grandma's things, and I was reading them sometime about in the past year because I hadn't seen any of these before. And there was this letter from Louisa where the first page or two, she's talking about the rat population, how hard it is to get food, how she had to make a blanket and sew it into a coat, so she had a coat, that kind of thing. And then she says, well, did you see on April 1st in our Kiel newspaper, we had big headlines that there were UFOs, and the Russians were claiming they made them. Well, the Russians claim they made everything, ha ha ha, little joke. And then the next page, she says, but of course, now we know that the UFOs are real, and they don't look like the saucers. They look like the cups, like the teacups turned upside down.
Whoa.
That she drew, and I've got her little drawings reproduced in the book, along with the envelope with all the postage markings, so you can see this is actually from that era. She drew this little diagram of something that looked kind of like a plate with this bell-shaped thing on it. It looked so much like what they called Die Glocke, or the bell.
Yeah.
And then she said, of course we know they are real because they look like this, and we know now that all of their flight and steering systems are located in the rim that flares out from the bell, which I've seen on the History Channel's shows. They've kind of plotted out how the propulsion would have to go, and that's what's involved.
That is so cool. What an amazing discovery.
Well, it was just so crazy, Well, what she was doing, she was kind of working my grandmother as a sponsor to get her over to the United States. She was desperate to get out of Germany, which makes me think some other things, because her last name was the same as one of Hitler's right-hand henchmen. And I don't know if she was related or not. And she did eventually get here. I actually met her one time. I think I was a teenager, and she had made it to Chicago, and she stayed friends with my grandmother, and they stayed in touch. And I remember her as this kind of just sort of meek little woman, kind of looking over her shoulder all the time, and didn't want to eat much, and just kind of stared at us, and didn't have a lot to say to us.
Mm-hmm.
Was just kind of strange, like she was always on guard, like afraid she'd be found out or something, was how it felt. But just such a strange thing. And then it comes back to all this military installation and the so-called werewolf legends that grew up around them.
Gosh, that is so cool. I always tell our listeners that, like, when you go home for holidays or visiting your family, ask your moms, ask your grandmas for stories, because you've always got them somewhere in the family. There's always some weird encounter story somewhere.
So
Which it just goes to show that a lot of this stuff is more commonplace than we really think. I mean, obviously, by reading your books, and especially this new one, you have no shortage of encounters, of eyewitness encounters
Right. No.
And do you think it's changing where, do you think it's becoming easier for people to admit that they've seen something? Do you think it's becoming more destigmatized? Because, it's obviously comes up, especially with, I think, like the generation before ours, is that that idea of like, I don't want to tell people I saw Bigfoot because I don't want to sound crazy. Do you think it's getting easier for people to come out and tell these stories?
Well, that stigma is still there. It definitely is still there. And a lot of people who are active in cryptozoology or even just, familiar with it are shocked to learn that not everybody knows who the Beast of Bray Road is.
Right.
And many people think Bigfoot are some kind of weird Yeti and to sell beef jerky with. And they have no idea, of the depth of it. But as far as the Dog Man goes, after I presented that to the world back in 91, 92, at least Elkhorn's little part of it, there was some hoopla enough to kind of make a sustaining motion that people started writing me and kept writing me. And then every time it would appear on TV, these isolated different TV shows or radio shows that I would do would kind of keep it going until I finally left the paper after about 10 years. But it was sort of lonely because, the Bigfoot people were just saying, oh, there's no such thing as a dog man. These are just snouted Bigfoot.
Yep.
And, and my rejoinder was, well, if you went to Africa looking for a gorilla and you saw a hyena, would you say that was a snouted gorilla?
Yeah, exactly. Would you call it a snouted chimpanzee or something?
Exactly, because they're very, very different types of animals, orders or families of animals. The canines have pointy ears. They've got very pronounced muzzles, even if they're somewhat shorter. They've got canine teeth. They walk on their toe pads. They've got tails. They're just built very, very differently. They move differently, and they do different things. So that was never anything that caused me to cast any doubt on the fact that these were there. But I'd say maybe about 7 years ago or so, the tide started to turn when, and maybe Monster Quest, the one that did 2 very big episodes on the Dog Man and then the Gable film at their end of their 4 seasons, started to make people go, oh, they do look different. And then as these TV shows expanded, but more than that, the internet, other people finally started collecting these stories and doing different things. Some just, read them as stories on podcast. Others, incorporated them into home documentaries. And the idea became more widespread. And in that way, I think there were more people who could validate the new sightings. If somebody would write into one of the Facebook forums and say, oh, I saw this, please tell me I'm not the only one, who saw a werewolf running up this hill or whatever. And somebody would always write back and say, no, we saw it. So you had this sort of fraternal association built in almost with these Facebook things. And now it's gotten to the point where I have no idea how many Bigfoot and Dogman oriented sites that there are, lots of them. And there's strictly no kill sites. Maybe we'll think about killing sites.
Mm-hmm.
They just vary, believers only, skeptics only, all permutations. But it's out there. The topic's out there. And people are at least talking about it and treating it like a phenomenon that other people have had that is worth discussing, even if we don't know what it is. And I certainly don't claim to know what they are, what essence they are made of. If I tend to think that the best paradigm to fit all the facts that people report is the Native American one, that there's sort of a sliding scale of substance, the substance of life, of living creatures. And
tell me more about that. I like that concept.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. They feel that all of these creatures, including not just Bigfoot and the Dogman, Thunderbird, but some of the large cats too. That they can be for instance, I've heard from very different people that the black mystery cats are actually spirit animals originally, like the Dogman or like Bigfoot. And that when they're here on Earth, they come from what we might call another dimension or something like that, another world. They call the spirit world, and they say they come here for specific purposes. They can procreate when they're here because they're solid. They can eat. They can leave droppings. They do all kinds of things and act almost like normal creatures in most ways, other than seeming to be extremely intelligent and staring at people in the eye and being very curious about humans as much as we are about them. It's like they come here to study us too, like that's part of their mission. And they do what they need to do here. And I kind of agree with that because there are a fair number of sightings from people who have seen Bigfoot with young ones, or even the Dogman. Like it would have to be a dog lady, I guess, maybe, unless it's a stay-at-home Dogman.
It's 2019. It's about time.
It could be, but I've had reports of them crossing roads with young ones, carrying young ones, and it seems like they have, and that seems to be part of their territorialism too, I suspect, because they seem to want other creatures, other weird creatures, other predators, and humans especially, to stay out of certain prescribed areas where they carry on a lot of their activities, and which become known as hotspots once we observe them enough times in these certain places. So they can go back, though, when they need to, and it also covers the times when people say, because there are more of these than I'm comfortable admitting to, where people will claim that they could hear it coming through the grass, and they were sure it looked like the size of footprints being made looked like giant human footprints, but they couldn't see it. So you have these ones where they're invisible in some way, or just kind of pulsing in and out of vision.
There's that cool eyewitness account in I Know What I Saw about the guy who saw, I can't remember what the gentleman's name was, but he noticed a large entity that he said was like a lenticular cover, where if you looked at it from this angle, you could sort of see the shape of the figure, but if you looked at it from this angle, it was almost like you were looking through that, like the Predator's like cloaking field or something. Like it was like a blend of, it was like an invisibility field from one angle, and then from another angle you could actually see the form of the figure. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And like some polar bears have really unusual hairs as part of their fur that are transparent and that can bend the light.
Right. All right. I remember that. That's crazy.
Yeah. And so that's another thing. So it may not be an unearthly ability after all. It might be something that's, just the best evidence of this or use of that particular thing that nature can do.
Well, and that theory makes me think of two things. One, which ties directly back to your book, which is this idea of these sort of spirit creatures or interdimensional creatures coming down into the third dimension to experience our reality. I mean, that sounds a lot like, to me, about the Greek gods up on Olympus. You have stories of, usually not for very good reasons, but like coming down and shape-shifting. Zeus turned himself into a swan. Like that reminds me of those myths. And
even the Christian Bible has those same things where, there was a divine council of beings with the Old Testament Yahweh that sat at his table and kind of did his bidding, and they were higher in order than the angels. And they're the ones that, if you read it, it's all there in the first chapters of the Bible, that were sent down to earth to kind of shepherd the fledgling civilizations, and ended up intermarrying with them, and instead causing these giant races.
That's where the Nephilim come from, right?
Yep, the Anunnaki, the Watchers, the Nephilim, that were the offspring of these visitations of these divine council members. They were giants, and if you look at the Bible tells very plainly that there were giants, not 28-foot tall Jack and the Beanstalk
Right.
giants. But within the known parameters of giantism that we have today, and in fact, for some reason, I was reading the David and Goliath story just the past week, and I was so struck how the measurements that were given and the measurements taken were very careful, because it was a thing that rather than risking their whole army, they would send the two biggest, best warriors out to fight. And usually these were giants, and they would try to match their giant or exceed it. So both the giants on both sides were measured completely. And I think they measured his leg armor for each leg was what would be equal to 125 pounds. He was 9 feet tall. Goliath was. His sword was the size of a weaving shaft, like a telephone pole or something. But it was very meticulously recorded, and we've got burials found all over the United States and other countries too, but particularly seeming in certain places around the United States, where the bones are of giants, and they're supposed to have double rows of teeth, and Goliath had 6 fingers on each hand.
Whoa, really?
Yes, if you read it's amazing, what is there in those first chapters of the Bible relating to these things if you take it at face value. And I mean, I'm a Christian, I'm a Lutheran, and which is, I think, conservative and generally pretty correct on most of their Bible related beliefs. But like most Protestants and many other people today, when they get to these sections where there are divine council members going down to earth, well, that's just something from that time. We'll never understand it. That maybe it's a metaphor,
right?
And the truth is sort of knocked out of it that way, because that's not what it says. It says they were there, they went down, they did this, and this is what happened. And that's why there's so much battling in that whole Old Testament, because Yahweh is trying to get rid of those remnants from the divine council members that had to stay on earth and turned into these sort of demigods that were against Yahweh's will.
Wow. Yeah, all this stuff has, as we've been doing the show further and further, and I think that your book really points to this. There are echoes of all of these types of entities that reverberate through all cultures, all stories, all encounters, and it really does make me think about that sliding scale and think that's probably a really good explanation for it. And really, at the end of the day, what's the difference between an entity slipping down into this dimension to experience our reality and us, if you believe in a soul, and if you believe in consciousness perhaps coming from a higher dimension, being born into this world and experiencing this dimension, eating, procreating, pain, pleasure, all that stuff. It's the same experience, right? At the end of the day.
Yeah, and if you look at universally the energy systems that seem to propel our universe, light, sound, whatever, they're all on sliding scales. It's not like there's black at night and there's white in day. There's nighttime when it gets very dark, and then you go to the dark grays and the lighter grays, and then if the light of the sun is mixed, it's a sliding scale of light vibrations. With sound, we have infrasound and ultrasound on opposite ends of the spectrum, and many people don't believe that there are dog whistles because they can't hear the sound,
right.
But the dog hears the sound, and we know that they're there. We can measure them with instruments, and our instruments have become such extensions of our natural senses. That's one reason we know so much more than people were able to certify in antiquity, although I think they maybe had finer senses in other ways then too, and just being in the habitats that they were without the kind of daily electronic grind that we have must have
been They're
much more
in tune with their environment than we are. We've sort of closed ourselves off more and more from the natural world, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Before we end this conversation, I need to bring up one of my favorite chapters from the book, which is Chapter 7, The Hidden Little People, which is awesome. I love the story that you have in the book about the guy who was out in the woods and seemed to encounter 3 or 4 foot tall entities with pointy ears, conical heads, or pointed hats that seemed to be just on the other side of the veil of reality. I'm fascinated with these stories for a couple reasons. One, we covered like some gnome stories on the show about particularly one family. I think it might have even been in Wisconsin or around that area, and I can't remember off the top of the head, but 2 different families encountering some sort of little gnome man that lived in their barn and terrorized their koi pond. And then, and I've mentioned, we talked briefly about this last time, but I had seen an entity outside my window that my dogs had actually alerted me to late at night, 4 o'clock in the morning, that sort of in June, July, which always seems to be that not only month of high strangeness, but time of day or night that high strangeness happens. And what I saw looked like I would describe being more of a traditional alien gray, but I had a gut feeling like I was witnessing something sort of that was terrestrial, or perhaps slipping in and out of this dimension, but felt more akin to my gut, like one of these little people or little entities, and wasn't necessarily something that hopped out of a flying saucer. Can you talk a little bit about those creatures? Elves and gnomes.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by them. I really am. I actually have a novel about a certain type of German gnome that travels across the ocean with the family he's bound to, and ends up having to go through all this stuff in America, like through 100 years. So I'm hoping that's going to get published one of these days.
Awesome.
But I did a lot of research on them, and I found that a lot of times they are also known as shapeshifters. And even in the UK, there's a type of elf that can shift into what really sounds a lot like a Bigfoot. And I have one of these in the book. It's got like a six syllable name that I can never remember. But there's again this kinship, and then they all have these conical hats. It looks like they're wearing little dunce caps or something.
Yeah, it's like David the Gnome.
Yeah, and some people will see them without the actual hat. It's like the skin is part of. It's like the cone shaped thing is just a part of their physiology.
Oh yeah, that's so weird.
Yeah, which is very, very strange. And they're always sort of either allied with or fighting with the fairy-like beings, which are small too, in most cases. And there are rules for interacting with these worlds in almost all places. Even Native Americans who talk about their little people, you're not supposed to look them in the eye, and never, never, never accept food from them,
right?
Or drink, anything, or you'll end up being part of their world, And you think of Rip Van Winkle,
Yep.
And then slept for 100 years or whatever it was. So there are all these commonalities, and they seem to be really allied with trees. I know I'm not sure if this is the one you were talking about in my book, but there's one that was called the Olympic Wood Elf.
Yeah, that one came. Yeah, that was the little entity, right? He described it as looking like it was a little tree almost.
Right, an ant or wood elf. They called it a skinny, creepy being that is a walking small tree thing. I guess that's the best you could explain something like that. And he said, I have a photo. It would really help me if you know of other people seeing this kind of thing. I've had an extremely hard time going out alone during the day and would like to have some closure. And I don't know if you can get closure from this sort of thing, but
no.
He wrote, I have loved the outdoors all my life and have a lot of anger about not feeling safe. That is my own stuff, I guess, but even if just one other person has had something like this, I will feel some sense of relief. And people do kind of sometimes get that feeling like it's not fair. I can't go in the woods because, there's a Bigfoot, there are wolves, there are these elf creatures that can hurt you. And there are really still a lot of places in the world where people will go around and determine if there are ant dwellings or elf occupied places that they should avoid, because if they build a house on it, they're in for trouble. The house will always be haunted, bad things will be done, their milk will go sour, etc., etc. So it's something that I think is still very close to folk belief.
I meant to write this down and I forgot to. There's the story in your book about what is it called? The haunchies, haunch
Oh
folk.
yeah,
Which
yeah,
that was an insane story. That there's like allegedly out in the middle of nowhere a small hidden town of little people that will attack anyone that comes into their village or scare
right.
them off.
Right, not just them, but they've got a regular sized man who drives a black pickup truck and carries a shotgun as their general muscle. And if he doesn't succeed in deterring people who come out trying to find them, then they come running out of the cornfield carrying small shovels and picks and hoes,
Spades.
Spades, yeah. And there are all kinds of other attaching legends, such as there was one where the man went in and somehow broke through their ranks, and they ended up killing him and hanging him in the barn, in a little barn, and that the shadow is still there, and there are little houses that you could once get to, but I believe, and now this road where they're on has always been called Mystic Lane,
Right.
which is kind of interesting. Most of that area has now been taken down for subdivision expansion because it's very close to this beautiful lake. But this is actually not with them killing people and all that, but I do believe there's some core of truth to this, because Wisconsin was one of the favored states for people to overwinter when we had all these traveling circuses. And in fact, Delavan, Wisconsin had the Clown Museum. You go to Baraboo, again, not far from that Pink Quartzite, and you have Circus World Museum. We're very tied to that, and there are other places where we know there was overwintering. And the same is true for the guys who wrote the Weird series, the Weird U.S. series.
Mm-hmm.
They have differently named, but very, very similar colonies where there's outside guards. There's someone who will punish you. They actually found standing little houses at one. And this is New Jersey and Florida. They have different names, but they're very much the same. And I have found evidence that there were various people who entertained in what they called the sideshows then. And most of these were just people with genetic problems or not. I hate to call them problems,
right,
because they didn't think of them that way. They were generally fairly happy and well-paid people doing what they did. But there was supposed to be a colony near Delavan Lake, which is not very far from where I live. Mm-hmm. And also, I might add, had giant sculptures found on the grounds also. But a friend of mine, a very close friend, said when she was young, her family was friends with this elderly lady that they just called Auntie. And they would go to Auntie's house, visit her a couple of times in the summer. She lived where there were she knew other circus people there. She didn't know what they were. But Auntie was quite distinguishable by looking at her arms and legs and feet, because she had thick fur like an animal on those parts of her body. And so they billed her as a dog lady or something like that, which probably set off another scores of other legends and things. But she remembers taking the cookie from the plate and looking down and seeing those furry feet. And, so that tells me they're really, and it makes sense. If you are very differently put together or look very different from most people, you're going to kind of want your own space where you can just kick back and people aren't going to, ask you if you're in the circus yet or whatever. And so why wouldn't they build small places acclimated to them that can be a bit secluded and where they can just sort of be themselves? Everybody has the right for that. And so I put more credit in that sort of so-called legend, because it has this base. It's based on real things and logical steps that these small people might take.
It's fascinating how small towns, and not even small towns, but across the United States, and you point this out in, I think, the last chapter of the book. You talk about how we tend to generalize creatures now, local legends, by just calling something Bigfoot, but like Missouri had Momo, or there's the cabbage head creature, which I love that, and Momo was said to have a pumpkin head. But it is fascinating that so many small towns have some sort of story of a mystical being, or, what you were just talking about reminds me of a story that my uncle, who's unfortunately no longer with us, he grew up in a very small town called Denver, Missouri. And there was a man that lived on a cabin down on the river, secluded, named Tom Sauer. And he had no legs, and he had wooden legs. And one of the things that my uncle, when he was a boy, would do is he and his buddies would go swimming down the river. And he said Tom Sauer would always be sunbathing out on the creek bed, and they would sneak up and steal his legs, and then he'd get really mad at them, and they thought that was a real fun prank to play. But they also got along with him, and my uncle told me that Tom Sauer was well known in the town to be telekinetic. He could apparently move objects with his mind.
Wow.
And he said that the adults would tell stories about seeing Tom levitate tables and make spoons spin in the air. And he, apparently they all talked about it as if it was a very real thing. It's just fascinating to me that, you find, again, that's a story that exists in my family tree. There have got to be countless of crazy stories like that.
Well, it takes away the preconceived notions we have about what's normal or even possible in the human being, and it just so often goes beyond what should be possible with our solid earth means of understanding what's around us.
Yeah. I unfortunately need to let you go. I can't believe how fast this hour has gone by. But before we do, a couple things. One, I'm very excited, and I don't know if I should spoil this or not. That's up to you. But in the end of this book, you admit to having eyewitness accounts to a cryptid yourself,
Yes.
Which I'm very, very excited. Was very excited to read. And if you've listened to our last episode with Linda, you can probably guess which cryptid that is. Can you say anything, or should we leave that for people to pick up and read when the book comes out?
Well, I think what I'd like to say is that regardless of the type of cryptid, and I'm pretty sure about this one because my encounters and sightings were daylight, close range, very, very hard for me to refute as being anything else. And it was very difficult for me to have these experiences and then decide what I do about them because, how convenient, as they would have said on Saturday Night Live, that here this person who writes stories about these things, should be endowed with sightings of them. And I have to point out that these occurred 20 years after I began this search, so it wasn't like it just happened overnight, and that I did kind of know where to look and had an awareness from the many, 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 many encounters other people had talked to me about. So there were all these mitigating surfaces, but I thought, well, I know I'm really going to take some hits if I put it out. And this went on for a couple of years where should I, shouldn't I? Another book went by, and then I got to this one, and it just struck me that it was very unfair and disingenuous of me to expect other people to cough up their own stories so that other people could have understanding of them and keep tight-lipped about my own. Mm-hmm. And I just felt, for honesty's sake, I had to do it and just let the chips. If people don't want to believe me, they don't have to. I don't really care. But I had to tell what I saw, just like the title of my book says, to be fair to the other witnesses and to people who might benefit from hearing what I had to say in my own experience.
Well, those encounters are very, very cool stories, and I actually think it lends more credibility. As someone who has been in this field, I would expect at some point you would have an encounter of your own, just because you're physically and figuratively living so close to the subject.
Right.
So, it's like saying that a truck driver is less credible as a truck driver because he's seen cars on the freeway. It's like, well, it comes with the territory, I think. Exactly. I don't know if that's a good metaphor or not, but Linda, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I didn't even get to half of my questions. The book is amazing. I know what I saw. where can people pick it up, and where can they pre-order it? And where can people email you with encounters of their own, should they want to share those stories?
Well, the books are pretty much available in any online distributor, all the Barnes & Noble, Amazon, whatever else, the one that you might like. So that's for starters. The brick and mortar stores, a lot of them, Barnes & Noble and others, have them on hand. So they're not hard to find, but there is a list of all my books in one spot. And pretty much my go-to spot is my blog, which is just Linda Godfrey, GODFREY.com. No W's or anything fancy like that. And you'll land on the main page. There's another page that says About, which has, you can scroll down a little bit, and there's a form you can fill out to send me messages, hopefully good messages, stories of things that you might have seen if you want to share those. It's pretty much all there at lindagodfrey.com. Also, many stories and things that have happened to me you can find posted there over the years from my blogs, and a lot of them are things that weren't in books or anything either. So just lindagodfrey.com, and that will also lead you to, I've got a Facebook page, Linda Godfrey, which is mostly just for random stuff, and then Linda S. Godfrey is my Facebook author page. Twitter I'm on, and you'll get all that from that website.
Great, that's awesome. And you have a documentary coming up, don't you?
I do, God willing that we finish the last fourth of it. But it's about those mystery cats around Hillsborough. Wouldn't you know, the same place where both my grandmothers lived has over 150 sightings just over the past several decades. And I give all the credit to a man who lives there, a former newspaper reporter and editor, who has collected them all and put them together and maybe writing his own book. I'm trying to encourage him. But my youngest son is a filmmaker, and we've been working on this with him since September. Lots of really motivated and credible, believable witnesses, incredible landscape. It's like nowhere else in Wisconsin for sure. Big, high, rocky crags, where it was the driftless area where the glacier didn't go. So it's perfect cougar habitat. And then over half of the sightings are of the so-called impossible black mystery cats, and nobody really knows for sure what they are. So we have a lot of witnesses, a lot of theories, and my son's doing an excellent job with it. You can go to Return to Wildcat Mountain and find the link to it either on YouTube or Facebook.
And we'll put a link to that trailer and to lindagodfrey.com in the show notes of this episode. So if you're listening, you can just pull those show notes up and go right to both of those. So definitely reach out. Definitely check out Linda's works. And if you do send her a message, it better be nice, because otherwise you're going to have the Bigfoot Collectors Club to deal with. Linda, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book. I Know What I Saw, Modern Day Encounters with Monsters of New Urban Legend and Ancient Lore. It is out July 16th. I'm telling you guys, you got to read this book, and you should read all of everything that Linda's written. So fun. And when the return to, what's Wildcat Mountain? Is that what's...
Right, Return to Wildcat Mountain. That's the name of the mountain in Hillsborough,
Great.
Actually.
When you do finish that film, because it links back also to that whole Hillsborough chapter in your book, I definitely want to have you back on the show to talk about it. So maybe we can even get your son on, and we can all talk about that film and talk about the black mystery cat phenomenon, which is really, really fascinating.
That would be fantastic.
Great.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all your listeners, too.
Oh, anytime, Linda. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Oh boy, I want to thank Linda S. Godfrey one more time for being a guest on our show. She is the best. I mean, she's like the real deal. She is one of our current living John Keels. She is going out into fields and pastures and forests and valleys, and she is finding these stories. She's finding people who have not told their story sometimes for decades, and she's getting it down on paper and getting it into your eyeballs. so cool. I really want to tag along with her on an investigation. I kind of want to be a paranormal investigator / cryptozoologist. Fuck acting. Let's do that instead. Who knows what I could see out there? I mean, we didn't even talk about the fact that there are people seeing a creature called the mule deer woman. She's half woman, half deer. And there's Native American folklore that has been talking about it for centuries. Hybrids are real. I think hybrids might be real. Are they aliens? Are they from another dimension? I don't know, but I think everything is real now, and we should be terrified. Well, that wraps up another episode of Bigfoot Collectors Club. As promised, here is a new track from the forthcoming album, Unfathomable Darkness by Suneaters, dropping at the end of the month. You can pre-order it on Lotuspool.com. Check it out. This song is called Night. And I bid you, on behalf of Bryce Johnson and Riley Bray, good night. Until next time, go get regressed.
whatever you do, it'll be alright. It'll be alright.